This is Darlene Lancer, and I want to thank uh, the Mind Journal for inviting me to talk to everybody about codependency. I've been writing and helping people with codependency for over 30 years, and it started way back when I was a new therapist and writing about it and helping clients with their relationships and individuation. And eventually, Wiley asked me to write Codependency for Dummies about 10 years ago. And then Hazelton asked me to write Conquering Shame and Codependency. So that's what my focus has been. And that's what I want to share with you today. And want to give you an overview. We don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about some of the challenges for codependence, the definition of codependency, the steps and the stages of recovery, and then what recovery looks like, and of course the symptoms of codependency. And so I'll give you kind of an overview, and then I'm happy to take any questions that people have. So this is pretty common for people with codependency. They have trouble saying no and setting limits. Their boundaries weren't honored in their childhood. And if you're not treated with respect for your feelings and your opinions and your needs, so you're not allowed to say no, you're not allowed to say stop. And when people are criticizing you and over controlling you and talking about you, that's a violation of your boundaries. So they grow up with that, and then it's hard as an adult to say no and stop. And they usually feel guilty. And then they go along and people please. So that's one of the symptoms. And then they feel resentful. So they're caught on this tightrope of either going along and feeling resentful, or saying no and feeling anxious and feeling guilty. And so that's kind of a struggle. And the next thing is just focusing on themselves. And I'll explain that more when I get to the definition. But they have trouble really thinking about themselves and their feelings and their needs and their wants. And they're really focused more on pleasing and adapting and accommodating to somebody else, because their relationships are the most important thing to them. And they have this underlying belief that if I'm liked and if I'm loved, then I'm likable and lovable. So then they end up trying to manipulate, please people, control what they say and how they behave rather than be authentic, so that other people will like them. And they often hide what they really think and what they really feel. And along with that is, because they're not focused on themselves and so focused on pleasing other people and adapting to other people, that they don't really know what they need. And usually their needs have been shamed in childhood. And then their wants maybe were shamed. They couldn't have what they want. They were told what to do or what they should have or what they should need. And it's hard for them to share negative feelings, give negative feedback. They'll give compliments, okay, but they don't want to say anything that's going to rock the boat. They want things just to be smooth in the relationship. They don't want to make waves. They end up walking on eggshells because they're so worried about what someone else will think. So making plans and doing something for yourself and carrying it out, that's hard. So codependents usually like to do it with a buddy. They do okay in a structured environment, like they may be the top of their class, or they perform really well in a bureaucracy, a corporate setting, working for an employer, in school. But left to themselves, it's hard for them to motivate themselves. They have trouble with a sense of agency. So they have inertia that it's hard for them to start a project, finish a project on their own. And then they are so focused on other people, they're really good at giving other people advice. And it's hard for them to stop themselves from giving advice. They feel like it's a compulsion that they know best and they want to help other people. And so in recovery, you learn like it's other people's problems are their own problems. And they get all entangled with everybody else's problems rather than it's a distraction really from their own feelings, and they're pursuing their own passions. They'll tell other people what to do rather than doing it for themselves. And then they have a problem with receiving. They're so invested in giving, and often they give too much, and then they feel resentful and they sacrifice themselves in relationships. So it's hard for them to receive. Sometimes even receiving a compliment, they will push it away and say, because they think they don't really deserve it. And you extrapolate that to love, they don't really feel like they deserve love. And then they end up in relationships with people that don't treat them well, or that are unable to love, or that are unavailable. So they have to really learn to love themselves. And that's a monumental task because there's so much shame underneath, which I'll talk about. And because of that shame and low self-esteem, they have trouble trusting themselves. They'll ask everybody else what to do. It's hard for them to make decisions. They're very indecisive, and it comes from not knowing what they want, self-judgment, and because their wants and needs and ideas weren't validated growing up. So when they're adults, they have trouble really doing what they want. They have a lot of self-doubt. So as I said, they're indecisive. So making decisions is hard. A lot of times they procrastinate because they can't make a decision. But the real problem usually is that they're afraid they'll make the wrong decision. And so that then they just get paralyzed. And that's kind of a decision too when you don't act. And one of the reasons they're afraid of making the wrong decisions is because they're so judgmental of themselves, probably because they were judged growing up. And because they're not really connected to themselves, they're so focused on other people, they tend to lose themselves in relationships. They give up who they are, what they want, what they need. They go along to get along and not make waves. And so they start adapting to their partner. And they think that will make them more lovable. It's not always true, actually, but they just try to adapt themselves and mold themselves to the person they're with. And it's usually someone with a stronger personality. So, and they look up to that because they don't have that in themselves. And the next thing that's really hard are breakups. They can take years to get over a breakup and hold a candle for someone, even what they weren't in a relationship with for years, because that they hold on to that relationship because, again, they're not really connected to themselves. It's hard for them to let go and move on. They give up so much of themselves in a relationship. When the relationship ends, they're devastated. They're empty. They've neglected themselves during the relationship. So let's look at the definition of codependency. Codependency, there isn't one definition, by the way. This is my definition. And I did a lot of thinking about it. Some definitions only show the person, only talk about the person in a relationship. But codependency is a problem whether you're in a relationship or not. It's a disease of the lost self. So people's thinking and behavior revolve around another person. It's what I was explaining before. Or it could be a substance like alcohol or drugs or food, or a process like gambling or sex. So it's an addictive process. And they're very focused, for a codependent, very focused on someone else. And if there's someone's addicted to a drug, for instance, or food, you take that substance away, and then you see the codependency that's underneath. It's the same dynamic. They're trying to fill themselves up. The emptiness inside and the estrangement and alienation from the self, they're focusing on someone else, or they're filling it up with a drug or with food, that emptiness that's underneath. And that goes back to their childhood. If you're using a drug to feel better or filling yourself up with food, the more you do that, the worse the problem gets. Not only does the addiction get worse, but it's like you're trying to go east and instead you're going west. So you keep going after the wrong thing because the solution is to come back to yourself, to come home to yourself. Instead, people are looking outside themselves. And the longer and the more they do that, whether it's food or drug or gambling or sex or a relationship, the further they get from themselves, until bit by bit, as I say, you lose yourself. You become totally dependent or just addicted to someone else. And again, if you lose that relationship, you've lost everything. You've lost yourself. And it's an addictive process. You can't stop, even though it's painful. So codependents stay in painful relationships. It's really, even abusive ones, even violent ones, it's hard for them to let go because so much is invested in that connection. So let's look at the symptoms of codependency. So there's this weak self I've been talking about, and there's this self-critical self on top of it that hides this real self, the true self, is now hidden with this critic and this shame that covers it. And so these are some of the symptoms that stem from that. So on the lower, my left, I don't know if it's your right or left side of the screen, is shame. And that's a core symptom that causes so many problems. And shame will cause more guilt. It'll cause anxiety. The anxiety is usually shame anxiety. It's the fear of experiencing shame. So I have anxiety being too close or revealing too much. That causes problems up on the top with intimacy. So if I can't be truthful and honest and open with you, then we're going to have problems being intimate. I might push you away, or I will hide the truth. And that's shame anxiety, that if you really see who I am, I said they have trouble sharing negative feelings, or if you really got to know me, you would see I'm really not worthy of love. I have all these flaws, and that's that critical self that chalks you down. And then that all leads to fear and low self-esteem, and eventually depression. And then down in the center of the screen, denial of needs and feelings. So there's a lot of denial. That's a core symptom for all addiction. Codependents don't realize they're codependent unless they've been told that, or they did some research about it, because they're so busy looking outside, they think someone else is the problem. I was in a relationship with an alcoholic, and someone told me that I needed help, and I thought, how dare they say that? Obviously, he's the one with the problem. He's the one that's addicted to alcohol. There's nothing wrong with me. I didn't realize that I needed to change, and that was hard work. And next to that is dysfunctional communication. So if you have shame, you're not going to be, as I said, honest. And not only that, codependents grow up in families where there's usually one parent is passive and one's aggressive. Assertive communication isn't learned. And people with low self-esteem aren't assertive. They're afraid to be honest. As I said, they can't say no. They don't know their needs. They don't know their feelings. They have been shamed. They're afraid to be honest about it. So they'll be roundabout. They'll say, what do you want? or they'll be evasive and indirect. They won't take a position. I once had a boss who would call me into my office and ask me my opinion, and I would beat around the bush because he was so judgmental, and I was afraid to just say what I was thinking. And he called me out of it, and it's pretty annoying if you're on the other side of that, when you just want a yes or no answer. But codependents are afraid of doing that because then they're afraid of being judged, that they're wrong, that they're making a mistake, that someone won't like them, they'll be rejected. So all those fears that are based on shame make communication very difficult. And they're always apologizing and feeling responsible for other people. And that gets into boundaries. So their boundaries are very weak. They can't set boundaries by saying no. They can't set limits. So their communication is, dysfunctional. Their boundaries are, they don't have good boundaries. Then they get hurt. Then they get abused. Then they end up doing things they don't want to do because they can't say no. Then they resent it, or they might pull away or make excuses because they can't say no. And it just goes round and round in circles. It's so confusing because, to be clear, you have to take a position and just say yes or no. And the thing is, people don't realize you have to have some autonomy and independence. And there comes, again, on the upper corner there, dependency. You have to know that you can get along by yourself. Because if you're so afraid, so dependent and afraid of losing a relationship, you won't be honest. You will try to please, and you won't make waves, and you won't take a position, and you won't say no. So those boundaries get blurred. So the more autonomy you have, this is a dialectical process, the more closer you can be to somebody. And you have to know that you can get along by yourself to be honest. So you have to have a little bit of independence to be truthful, to take those risks. Recovery is all about taking a lot of risks that are very scary. So finally, a major symptom of codependency is controlling other people, taking care of them, trying to fix them, giving advice to them, or change them. They get into relationships and then they try to change the other person. And that's so they'll feel better. They don't want to deal with their own feelings, their own anxiety. So they focus on somebody else to change them. So now I'm going to talk about the steps to recovery. So the first step is coming out of denial. And that you can go to meetings, Codependency Anonymous, work with a therapist, do a lot of reading about codependency, and you start to become more aware, self-aware. Now, that's kind of tricky because when we're in denial of something, it's unconscious. So you say, how do I know what's unconscious? How do I know what I'm not aware of? You're kind of in a double bind. So in my book, Codependency for Dummies, here it is, on page, there's the screen. On page 175, I have a list of questions that people can ask themselves to see. That'll help you know if you're in denial. If you're in a relationship just hoping the person will change, if you're feeling hurt and you think you might be abused and you don't tell anybody about it and you rationalize it and minimize it, those are some signs of denial. You're waiting for, if only he would change, if only she would change. You're looking for, or maybe when we get married, maybe when the person stops drinking, maybe when we have a baby, when they finish school, when they get a job. You're just thinking, if only something else happened, then things will be okay. That's a sign of denial and making excuses, covering up, not telling your friends or family how bad things are. You're trying to hide things. Then you're probably in denial about some things about the relationship. And denial doesn't mean that you're just unconscious of what's going on. You might think, well, this person is rude and verbally abusive, but I know they love me, or it really doesn't bother me that much, or it bothers me, but I'm not willing to do anything about it. So there's levels of denial. It's not like you totally don't know what's going on. So denial is a hallmark of addiction. So someone who's addicted to a drug or alcohol, they will deny that they have a problem until they really hit bottom. So then the next step is detaching from others. And that's really, really hard because we're so focused and triggered by other people. And detaching doesn't mean breaking up or leaving. It's more about not reacting emotionally. And I have a whole chapter on detachment in the book on dummies, the dummies book on codependency. And I wrote a blog about detaching with love. And I have several blogs on my website, whatiscodependency.com, on denial. And some of those questions are in my blog. So then step 3, and these aren't all in a strict order. Sometimes you do one, then you go to another, and you cycle back, is healing your wounds and learning about what caused your codependency, trauma you experienced. I'm not going to discuss that today. And building your self-esteem. And building your self-esteem is something you can do. Self-esteem is learned in childhood, and usually codependents have low self-esteem because of their childhood. And you can do things to raise your self-esteem. One of the first books I wrote was an ebook called 10 Steps to Self-Esteem, the ultimate guide to stop self-criticism. Because stopping self-criticism is the most important thing to do to raise your self-esteem. People don't realize how much negative talk they have. And that includes shitting on yourself. I should do this. I shouldn't have done that. All day long, telling yourselves what you should do or shouldn't do. And I have a webinar on how to build your self-esteem. These are all available on my website, whatiscodependency.com. And then the next one of the other things is to enjoy hobbies and family and friends. If you're in a relationship, not make your relationship the total center of your life, and not just depend on that relationship for all your needs. That's impossible. And have hobbies. Have something else that's important to you outside your significant other. And then be assertive, like number 6. Learning to have functional, healthy communication. And as I said, your communication reveals your self-esteem, and it's also dialectical. So when you become more assertive, it builds your self-esteem. And when you build your self-esteem, you become more assertive. So I wrote an ebook on how to speak your mind, become assertive, and set limits. And I have a webinar, how to be assertive. And then what I mentioned earlier is really hard, how to learn to love yourself. And it's not about bubble baths. It's about having boundaries. It's about doing the hard work of self-discipline, of taking care of yourself, responding to your needs, especially emotional needs. So typically codependents in their youth or childhood, their emotional needs were ignored or shamed or neglected. So they don't really have nurturing tools. It's unusual for them. It's a little foreign. So learning how to nurture yourself, and I have several blogs on self-nurturing and self-love meditation. So you can listen to it and practice those words and speak them to yourself. And then finally, in the later stages of recovery, is to follow your passions. Not just support somebody else, but go after your dreams. My first career as a lawyer was really to get the respect and approval of my parents. And it didn't help. They wondered, why did you become a lawyer? But I always wanted to be a therapist. So, you know, halfway through my adulthood, I went back to school and became a therapist, which is what I wanted to do when I was 12. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so signs of recovery would be when you're more authentic, when you're not afraid to be yourself. And by the way, the more authentic you are, it starts to heal shame. But that can feel very risky. So one safe place to do it is in therapy or at a 12-step meeting where you won't be judged, and practice that, and practice with people closest to you, and build more autonomy. Do things by yourself, even take trips by yourself, and that you are capable of intimacy. So as I said, it goes together, intimacy and autonomy, and being authentic, having functional communication, knowing you can stand on your own, and then you're really capable of intimacy. You're not feeling so ashamed. You have better self-esteem, and you can risk being honest, even if it means upsetting somebody else. And you can talk it through. And if they don't accept you, then maybe that relationship wasn't a good one to begin with. And being congruent with your values, your beliefs, your thoughts, your feelings. So you're really integrated in who you are, and you speak and walk your truth. You know what your values are, your beliefs are. You're not just adapting and accommodating to somebody else. So the definition is your feelings and thoughts revolve around someone else rather than your innate self. So recovery is really turning that upside down. And your thoughts, your feelings, your actions, everything needs all come from within. And then it's up to us to meet those needs, to express them in the world. Recovery is a transformational journey of self-actualization toward autonomy and integration. We reconnect to our real self that's hidden beneath learned false ideas. That's the shame that you get in childhood from poor parenting. We internalize those as true, or from traumatic experiences, or from bullying and things like that. So you have to reconnect with that real self that's innocent and pure underneath that. And so it's really a process of self-actualization. And I'm happy to take questions from anyone if you have them. Okay. Early in a relationship. Okay. So codependents often get into relationships quickly. So that's the first thing. And they tend to idealize their partner. And there's a saying, like, the more depressed you are, the greater your idealization will be. So depression often underlies codependency. And it's not like you're crying all the time or can't get out of bed. It's just maybe apathy, can't motivate yourself to do things on your own, perhaps, or it could be hidden. But underneath, often there's a sense of emptiness. And so codependents latch on. And by the way, they usually are looking for that true love that is going to make them happy, the love of their life, their soulmate. That's often the most important thing for a codependent. I would say not all codependents, but I'm talking about the stereotypical one. And so when they meet someone, and of course, when you're dating, there's a sense of euphoria and romance and lust. So all that takes over. Part of that's biological, I have to say. But codependents tend to move quickly. And when there's signs of someone not meeting their needs, not respecting them, they tend to overlook it. They don't, as I said, they don't want to make waves. So if you find that you're dating or you're in a relationship and you're on eggshells, or you're having resentments, you're complaining to your friends about something, or you're thinking about it but not sharing it, that might be a sign. If there's things you don't like and you won't say no. So that idealization can get you into trouble because typically your codependents, they fall in love with someone. I have a chart in my other book, Conquering Shame and Codependency. Oops, yeah. And codependents will fall in love and then they get to know the person. So a healthy relationship, you get to know the person. And you then, if there's things you don't like, and then you accept it if there's enough good, and you fall in love and you build a relationship. So codependents do the opposite. They fall in love, then they really get to see the person's flaws, and then this is so typical. And then they try to change the person back into what the ideal was. Like you were so great, in the beginning. And then another sign would be if they're being abused, they're being criticized. So if someone's unavailable, they're always pursuing someone unavailable, that would be a sign too. Probably it's because they're unavailable, but they don't know it. I have a blog about how to spot emotional unavailability. So both in someone else and in yourself. So are there any more questions? Yes. Yes. It takes two. A lot of times people say, oh, my partner is so codependent. Well, if you're in the relationship long enough, it's probably both of you. As a matter of fact, in the Dummies book, I have a whole big chapter on relationships. And I talk about the stages of relationship based on your individuation and how emotionally, you could say, mature you are, how much of a separate whole person you are is another word for individuation. Individuation is a psychological term. It means that you own your own feelings, your thoughts, your perceptions, your beliefs. So they're not just someone else's or what your family taught you. So you become an individual. People usually gravitate to someone at their own level of individuation. This has nothing to do with codependency. That's just how people are psychologically. It may look different on the outside, but unconscious, if you look at this psychodynamics underneath, they're about the same level. Maybe not exactly, but roughly. And so that would be why, even though, so people say to me, my partner is so codependent. And then we're in therapy together, and then they start to see, or they're in therapy together, start to see their own codependency. But they don't look at themselves because of the denial. They think it's someone else. So, for instance, if a codependent is involved with an addict, addicts are codependent too. They're dependent on their drug, and underneath that is the codependency that I'm talking about. If both partners are codependent, when do you give up trying to make things work? Why would you give up? I don't understand that question. You can both be in recovery. You could be in couples counseling, but you both need individual counseling. And by the way, some codependent relationships work okay. I know friends of my parents, decades ago, these people are dead. And the wife her husband was a doctor, and they called each other mother and father. And she basically did whatever. He was the boss. He was not bossy. He was kind, but it worked for them. So it doesn't always mean that you have to split up. Often there's abuse that might be a problem, but some couples, they're just, thick as thieves, and they're happy. So you don't necessarily have to leave the relationship. Well, this is a very interesting question because people always say to me, "Oh, he won't let me leave," or she won't let me break up with her. I keep trying and she won't let me break up with her. That sounds so codependent to me because you don't need someone's approval to break up. So you just say, this isn't working, and it was good while it lasted. And I'm leaving. I'm going to date other people now, or I'm going to divorce you if that's what it takes. So you don't need someone else's permission to leave the relationship, but that takes courage. So when someone says, "Oh, my wife or my girlfriend or my boyfriend won't let me leave," what that means is they're not ready to leave. So maybe it means, maybe the question is really, how do you get to the place where you're able to leave? I have an audio file on my website called Breakup Recovery, because it's so hard for people when they break up. But I would start building more autonomy. That's one of the steps in recovery, is, spend time with friends, have hobbies. It's hard. I mean, when I was in a marriage, I was very new to codependency. I realized one day, and I was very unhappy. It was an abusive relationship. But I realized one day it occurred to me I would leave not because I was so unhappy, but because I was happy. And that's exactly what happened. The marriage, it wasn't important to my life anymore. So it's hard to leave if you don't have a life. And that's one of the problems of codependent relationships. People, they cling to each other, and it's like you and me against the world. And they think that, and maybe COVID has made this harder for couples for sure. I have a blog about COVID and boundaries. But you need other people in your life. No one person can meet all your needs. So it's good to, and healthy marriages, they maintain their individual friends. So do that. Go to meetings, Codependency Anonymous meetings, to meet other people, and have a life that you enjoy. Because when you leave that relationship, you'll be single. And if you don't have a life you enjoy, you'll just get into another codependent relationship to try to, lift your loneliness and depression, emptiness. Oh, that's a really good question. Well, as I said, it's not necessarily toxic. And by the way, I should say that it's a very Western idea. So if you look in the Middle East, in Russia, most of Asia, Latin America, by these standards, families are enmeshed and most of the relationships are codependent. But that's normal in that culture. So it's a cultural issue too. And I don't think it's necessarily toxic if it's causing pain. But often it's with someone who is an addict, someone is being disrespected in the relationship, or being abused in some way. So that's toxic. I have a blog. I have about 200 blogs on my website. I think it's called are you in a toxic relationship, or signs of a toxic relationship? And so you could look at that to see, but it's not necessarily toxic. It might be detrimental to your evolution, self-realization, as I said, but that's an individual choice, whether you really want to invest in evolving yourself as an individual. Some people are just happy to have, a happy relationship and not work on themselves. So sometimes other people, because of their painful relationships and trauma, end up forced to do that to heal. Okay. Well, do follow me on Facebook. I have a page called Codependency Recovery. And Darlene Lancer, LMFT, stands for Licensed Marriage and Family Therapist, is my handle on Instagram. And I have a YouTube channel if you look for my name. So there are a lot of videos and interviews there on codependency. And on my website, which I shared with you, there's a media page, and I have there a lot of podcasts and interviews and webinars. Oh, thank you. And what else? So there's, on Twitter, it's my name, Darlene Lancer. Follow me there. And also I have on LinkedIn, you can see me there. If you Google me, I'm like all over the internet. I write also on Medium, and the Minds Journal, of course, publishes all my blogs. And could you also put up the new book that is coming out like in about a month? There we go. It's Dating, Loving, and Leaving a Narcissist. I also have an ebook called Dealing with a Narcissist, but this is much more up to date. There's a lot of research in there, and it covers, it's much broader because it covers dating and leaving and things like gaslighting and ghosting and trauma bonds and learned helplessness. And you really get to understand the mind of a narcissist. And the reason I've written about narcissism was I didn't realize, but after I wrote Codependency for Dummies, so many people contacted me because they were in relationships with narcissists. So I started writing books about it. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming and joining me. And you can email me on my website is my email. Follow me. I blog every month. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again. Bye.